Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Faith and Family First. I'm your host, Eva Andrade, and I'm here once again with my co host, Marcus Oshiro, as we delve into the most recent executive order of President Trump eliminating the Department of Education. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Let's chat about that. Marcus, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Sorry I can't be with you in studio, but I'm here in my backyard in my patio.
Well, you know what? I really love the background. I love the surfboard. A lot of our listeners and viewers may not know that you actually are a beach baby, aren't you?
I'm a beach baby. Yeah, I'm a
So,
beach
wait, how,
baby.
how often do you go to the beach?
I try and go as often as I can, several times a week. I need to do that. It helps out with life, keeps everything in balance.
I love telling the story that once when I was younger, we used to go out to a place we used to call Baby Bay. It was out, Waianae side, and it was a small little cove. And we used to go there as kids all the time. It's been filled in since then. So, even though the cove is still there, you can't swim because they filled in with all these big rocks. But I remember I was a beach baby too, and I was always in the water. And I remember one time, so it was maybe about 4:30, 5 o'clock. We were getting our last swim in. I was pretty much the only one swimming. My dad and everybody else was out on the shore. And my dad stood up, Marcus. He stood up and he pointed behind me. And I turn around and I see this big wave coming in. And, I'm born and raised in
Yeah.
Hawaii. So I just dove under the wave. What I didn't know is that, as you know, waves come in sets. And I got caught in the curl of the second wave.
Oh,
Oh, Marcus, that was like one of the most scary experiences because I just tumbled, tumbled, tumbled. I ate sand. I had sand in my
a
hair.
washing machine. Yeah,
Oh, it
yeah.
was bad. And then it threw me on the shore, pulled me back in for the third wave. It was just a freak set of waves. To this day, I still remember because when I was up on that last time I was coming in on that third wave, I was looking down on that whole road that goes out into Nanakuli, so you can see how high that
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
But I bring that up as we delve into today's show because I think that that's what is happening a lot with under all of the administrative orders that are coming out under this president, not just this president, President Biden, when he was in office, he did a whole bunch of executive orders. I mean, this has become the way that a lot of presidents do their work now. They do these executive orders. So, as we jump into this question of whether the Department of Education should be established, I think what would be helpful, Marcus, is if you could remind people what an executive order is and, does it have the force of law? How does that work? I mean, could Congress overturn anything that's done in an executive order? So, I will turn it over to you to kind of remind people of what an executive order is.
Yeah, the executive order that President Trump is issuing, he's issued many from his first day in August, office, January 20th. I think this is one of the first. It's a follow through on his campaign promise when he was out there to eliminate the Department of Education. But this executive order does not eliminate the Department of Education. The Department of Education was a creation of the Congress, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, I believe back in 1980 or something around that time, 79, 80, when President Carter was our president. And that's where it came from. So obviously, President Trump's proclamation or order cannot uh, put away or take away a department. And in this case, the department remains. It's interesting to note that his executive order does speak to the fact that he wants to put the responsibility for public education, higher education, back with the states and the municipalities and the counties, away from the federal government. And in the order, he states that this will not decrease the funding, but all the funding will be transferred to the states.
So what do you say when people start questioning? Because what I've seen in a lot of Facebook posts is, especially people in the disability community, they're very afraid that once this happens, that all these kids in the school that have special needs, that have all these extra things, are those going to be taken away?
Well, at this time, they will not be taken away. Let me look at what the current Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, stated. She said that closing the Department of Education does not mean cutting off funds from those who depend on them. We will continue to support K through 12 students, student with special needs, college student borrowers, and others who rely on essential programs. So she stated that, and she's been also stating that she's made the circuit on different television and podcasts throughout the nation. So that's the first iteration from the Secretary of Education. But for folks in Hawaii and other states, there is concern about decreased funding. I know that in their most recent congressional resolution, continuing resolution of funding to avert any government shutdown, that the current appropriation amount in the budget is the same as fiscal year 2024. So as you and I know, that's fiscal year 2024. That's the last year's appropriation. It's continuing for the fiscal year 2025 to the end of fiscal year. It's not an increase from last year. So there might be a decrease of overall funding through the Department of Education to the states, just because it's not an increase as far as keeping up with inflation, and rising cost. I think the state of Hawaii gets about, I have a note here, 240 to $320 million a year from the Department of Education federal. And one area of concern is the IDEA, that's the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And that's a congressional act that requires schools to make accommodations and provide services for those individuals who are physically, mentally challenged. And the state gets about 50 to $60 million from the federal government for that program alone. And so for those parents who have their children in those special need programs, I can see where the concern may come from. But if the federal government was to cut short, and it has not, as we speak today, that's where the state of Hawaii will have to find additional resources or funds locally to fill that gap.
So why do you think, so you gave a really good background of, where the whole Department of Education, so it's been around for 40 years, right? So for 40 years, Department of Education's been around. For 40 years, we've been paying money in. So I guess billions of dollars have gone into the Department of Education. And a lot of people, if you look back at the history of the development of the Department of Education, right, it was really to help the lower income students, right? They were really looking for an equity in and I know I'm saying the word equity and I think people are freaking out already, but I mean, they really were trying to make sure that kids on the other end of the spectrum who maybe didn't have all of the money and all of the added resources that higher students had or people with more money, they wanted to make sure that everybody was treated fairly in the educational system. So the question that's being asked now is, has it been a successful program? And a lot of people feel it has not been a successful program. So do you believe that this is why the president is taking the route that he's taking?
Yeah, I think the president is of the belief and understanding, and so is his supporters, that the Department of Education has been but merely a pass-through of appropriations that normally would have come from Department of Agriculture, that's the food lunch program, or Department of Human Services. That might be the programs dealing with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or those even Title One, right? Those are the low-income students or low-income communities that would, in the past may have come through the Department of Human Services. So I think that's how the president looks at the Department of Education, as being a funding mechanism, not really a programmatic types of program for the funding.
So here's a question I'm sure a lot of people, especially people that watch this whole educational system and what's happening in the public schools, right? And there's been a lot of outcry over the past couple of years on things like, critical race theory, gender identity, sexuality, all this stuff. So how does the Department of Education, or does it influence all of these type of topics?
I don't really think the federal Department of Education affects those kinds of policies at the local school levels. I think number one, I think much of that is a creation of the local school boards, and in our case, our local school boards, our superintendent, our board of education, they're the ones that promulgate and shape these local policies. Again, going back to the Department of Education federal level, that's mainly a funding stream of support for the states. Eva, our education budget is about $2.2 billion a year. And I think the amount of monies that we receive, the 240 to 320, is about 13% of our state DOE appropriations and expenditures. So the majority of the funds that we spend here are locally sourced through our state system. And we're unusual in the sense that we have a unified state system of our 1.4 population on all five islands. So it's different from the mainland schools where you have municipalities, you have counties, you have funding based primarily upon real property assessments. And then the richer districts get more monies, the poorer districts get less monies. Hawaii is different. We are a unified system. Monies seem to be more or less equitably shared amongst all the schools, regardless of whether you're rural or urban or in Neighbor Island or Honolulu schools. So I think the overall impact will be upon us picking up any slack in those areas, about 13%, should the federal government pull back. But as of yet, according to the Secretary of the Department of Education, there have been no funding limitations, except for the concurrent resolution that is appropriating at the fiscal year 24 level, not at the fiscal year 25 level.
So this executive order, and we encourage people, I always encourage people, read. There is a web page dedicated on President Trump's website where you can read all of his executive orders. And if you're one of those people that don't want to have anything to do with President Trump, then you can get it from the Federal Registry website where you can see all of the executive orders. And I really encourage people to read them. It's a very brief executive order. It's only 2 pages long. It's
Yeah.
Executive Order 14242, and it's dated March 20th, 2025. And the title is Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. So I think when people read that heading, I think most people would agree that parents should be the first line of defense in education of their children. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the executive order itself. It's a very brief order, so I want to get your thoughts on the order itself.
Well, yeah, it is a very short order, and it's available 24/7 for free on the internet, March 20th, 2025. It's entitled Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. And I think that's what the intention is. Again, it's not repealing the Department of Education. That's an act of Congress that has to go before Congress, and we'll see how they wrestle with it. But at this point in time, what the president is pointing out is that his concern is that the monies that we've been appropriating through the Department of Education have not been getting down to the schools, and most importantly, have not been delivering and giving us a return on our investment by increased scores, English reading scores or math scores. And we're on a lower percentile when we compare ourselves to other nations and countries where they may spend less money on public education, but get higher scores or higher results, for their students and their families.
Yeah, I was reading some reports and I was very concerned that not only on the graduation rates, right? Although Hawaii, I think, has a pretty good graduation rate, but when I'm looking like across the nation at the level of intelligence that comes out of people graduating college, I was really shocked at some of the numbers I was reading. And I don't want to throw out a number off the top of my head because I don't want people texting me when that's not accurate. But I was concerned that we aren't on the level that we should be when you look internationally at the rates.
Well, I've always taken this view. Maybe it's somewhat provincial, but I've always looked at Hawaii being a unique nation, unique state, and actually being set apart from most of the continental states that we're so far here out in the middle of the Pacific that we're close to a more global community, especially with Asia, that we should be competing globally. We shouldn't be
Hmm.
competing against our neighbors next door, but really thinking about a global scale of how we can empower our students in their abilities to be really globally competitive. And I think that's the most important for our public education system, K to 12, post-secondary schools, and of course our colleges and universities. How do we give and allow our students to become globally competitive? And I think that's where the investment in education is always top of mind for us. So even right now, as the legislature is struggling with its budget because of all the changes going on at the federal level, I think there's talk about how do you prioritize the state's budget of $20 billion. And I think they're thinking along the lines that I appreciate is that education is number one, health is number two, human services is number three, and then security, right? Law enforcement, police, corrections. But those are the big areas that government needs to provide the services. Education, of course, it should be top of mind, along with health and human services.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Marcus, because we want to make sure that people stay plugged into the show because you and I are going to be delving into the budget in the next show. So people stick around for next week because, a lot of us people of faith, we don't think about the budget and we don't think about how that might apply to the things we care about as people of faith. But stay tuned, people, because Marcus has a lot of experience of working with our budget. Because again, I know I love to you know tell people all of your experience, Marcus, but you were the chairman of the finance committee in the House. And so you know what it's like to go through the budget process and things have to be cut, right? There's always things that have to be cut. And you've got people coming down to the Capitol and they're demanding money for whatever services they provide. And some of those hearings in the old days, I remember used to be hours and hours. I don't know how you all dealt with it, but education is part of the budget. So we're going to be talking about that. So thanks for bringing that up, Marcus. I appreciate that.
Yeah, in fact, I just was reviewing a tape, a video of a hearing on House Bill 1369. House Bill 1369 for your listeners or viewers. House Bill 1369 was put in by Chair Yamashita, and it's a bill that we looked at something similar back in 2010. But this bill seeks to address the question of what are appropriate tax credits, what are appropriate general excise tax differentials, or what are appropriate subsidies given to different businesses and industries. And he floated that measure, and it's still alive, being considered by the state Senate right now. But it will generate about $200 million plus if you were to eliminate some of these credits that currently are existent today, going back maybe to the 50s and 60s. And it's interesting to note that he's thinking along those lines because if he can repeal some of these tax cuts, then that might be a way of generating or increasing revenue to pay for all the shortfalls that they envision or they foresee that may occur from the federal levels. And especially in the area of education, no, it's only 13% of our $2.2 billion expenditure every year, but that's a sizable amount of money when you talk about Title One for community funding, $100 million, or Individuals with Disability Education Act, that's another 50, $60 million. That's real money that needs to be found if there's any shortage from the federal side.
I love that. And I really like it. I like your addition to the show, Marcus, because I think that you are taking the show to a whole new level to where people can really see how all of these things tie in together. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in upcoming show too is when there's a deficit in the budget, the legislature has to get creative on how to bring funding in. And that's normally when things like, legalization of marijuana, legalization of gambling. That's why a lot of these bills come up. So give just a little teaser on how some of this ties into the budget in a future show so that people want to stay plugged in.
Yeah, they gotta stay plugged in because there are still circulating out there some bills to support the medical marijuana industry and to increase the consumption sale of medical marijuana. That's being bantered about as some kind of economic development or further revenues increasing potential there. There's also this idea about gaming or gambling, or or whatever you call it today. But it's gambling, right? And that's being proposed as a panacea for some of the budget shortfalls. It comes up alongside, any kind of budget shortfall or concerned about revenue decline, about expenditures soaring and revenues not keeping pace with that. So, of course, there is a gambling bill being pushed very strongly. It's in the state Senate right now. We'll see how far it goes, but let's talk about it, Eva, in any time.
Yeah, you guys got to stay plugged in because we really want to show you why the faith-based voice is so important and why we need to be plugged in, even when, and trust me, I am not into math. I've never been into math. I liked logic more than math, geometry kind of stuff, but definitely not into all this math stuff. And boy, just looking at the budget, it gets out of control. But going back to this executive order, what would be so if Congress doesn't like what the president is doing, could Congress do something to stop any executive order that the president comes up with?
That's a good question. I don't really know what they can do. I mean, there's a separation of powers between the three branches, right? You have the judicial branch, you have the legislative branch, and you have the executive branch. So Congress and the U.S. Senate is the legislative branch. They are in charge of the purse string, so they can appropriate money, give expenditure directions to the executive branch. The executive branch is in charge of executing on the legislature's prerogatives or decisions or directives. So if the president chooses not to follow the will of Congress or the legislature, they can kind of slow walk it. They can go and create some administrative, executive-based ways of slowing it down. Um, there are ways that the executive branch, including the local governor executive branch, can kind of thwart the will of the legislature because they are the executive. They are the final stop in the process. So that could be a result on what happens here. Obviously, that may mean that there may be a compromise on what can happen to these monies. It may turn into a block grant kind of program where block grants are given to the states to expend the money how and where and how they seem best fit for their constituency, for their schools. I know that some states would like that to have that kind of control. Other states may be a little concerned about that, and Congress might be because you want to make sure that you keep track of the expenditures, you keep track of monitoring that they're being used for the intended purposes. So that's another concern about not having a department overseeing the expenditures and release of the monies to make sure that we as taxpayers get a return on our investment.
So now, do you think that that's where the disconnect is between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on this issue?
Well, I think it's interesting politically. If you talk about the Republicans and the Democrats, that most of the red states will be dramatically affected if there is any huge cuts to the Department of Education budget, the current budget right now. I can see most of those red states would tend to be maybe some economically challenged states in the southern part of the United States or in the southeast part of the United States being challenged by some of these cuts, and they'll have to pick it up on that level. You know, we're at 13%, 11 to 13% of our overall education budget from the federal government. There are other states you have 26%, 30%. I mean, think about Wyoming, think about Kentucky, think about, Louisiana, Mississippi, some of these small, smaller, I mean, these Western states that rely heavily upon federal monies coming in for their public school system. So it's kind of interesting to see how this might work out, between the legislative branch and the executive branch.
Yeah, and so, as we're talking about this, we get, right, that this executive order is going to create a very bumpy situation, right? There's going to be some things that we're anticipating, there's going to be things that people aren't anticipating. So, what can people of faith do about it? I mean, other than staying plugged in and reading the executive order, do you think that we should really start to play a bigger role in what's happening in our public school system? Attending school board meetings, maybe. Having people know who their school board reps are. I mean, are there other things you can think about?
I think all of the above. I think they need to be attentive to the school board meetings. It's easy to access it today because they do so much on Zoom. I think that's one of the blessings of the COVID-19 era is that we learned about Zoom. Okay, I'm not promoting any product or anything like that, but this ability to go and attend a meeting from the safety and security and comfort of your own home sofa office, right? Kitchen table is wonderful. You can access these tapes. I mean, go to the DOE website, state DOE website. You can even hear a superintendent, the board meetings, they're all there. You got an attendant, you got to participate. Go to the PTSO, down the street, right? Go to the PTSA and definitely stay engaged and stay involved. I think it's a responsibility of citizenship in this republic. We need to be involved. If it's government for the people, by the people, of the people, you gotta play a role in it, right? You gotta participate. And I
Yeah,
think it's especially important when in these times of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think that we have to really encourage parents. I remember when I had custody of my grandson and he was going to he went through the public school system. There's so much paperwork, Marcus, that parents have to sign at the beginning of the year. I know that it's tough, but, even if you've got two jobs, it's really important to pay attention to what's happening in the classroom. Um, take a look at your kids' assignments, see what they're doing. What COVID did for me is my grandson was in high school when COVID happened. And so a lot of his classroom was right there. I could hear the teacher, I could hear what they were learning. And boy, it was an eye opener for me. So I think that even if you don't have kids in public school system or grandkids, that you need to be aware of what's happening in the public school system because it affects the community, right? So what they're learning is what they're going to take into the community. And then you're wondering, why are these things happening? So it's really important, right, that parents and people in the community stay plugged in, right? Even if they don't have kids in the system.
That's true. 80% of the community is attending public school. It's just 20% or less attend private school or parochial school. So it's really, we need to pay attention to what's going on in the public schools, grade
Yep.
K to 12, and as also the community colleges, the universities, but most importantly, the public schools, grades K to 12.
So, do you have any last thoughts for us as we get into our last minute or so here?
Well, I think it's important for the community of faith because they gather together quite frequently. I know every week, I believe they gather together on Sundays. I think to use that opportunity outside of the religious services to socialize and spend time with each other, and that's and have discussions and learn about the different ongoing issues. And I know that you and I are always available for any of those opportunities outside during the evening or the weekends or, other ways. to help people get involved. And I'm really encouraged by these shows that we have, Eva, because I want to make myself available to share whatever insight and knowledge I have of my 23 years of experience in the legislature. I want to empower people to engage their government. That's their right. And I think it's their civic duty also.
Yep. So send me an email at info@hawaiifamilyforum.org if you're interested in Marcus, and I can make that connection for you. We definitely can come and do any kind of workshops and trainings. Hawaii Family Forum has been doing them successfully for years. So reach out to us. Make sure you like this video, share, subscribe, hit that notification button every time, so that you'll know every time we upload a new video. And stay tuned for next week because we're going to delve into that budget and you want to know where your tax dollars are going. So we'll see all of you next week. Mahalo, everybody.